Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Sam and this is The Lonely Chapter, a show where we speak to interesting people, finding out their stories, discovering what motivates them, whilst also learning from their highs and their lows. Today we're learning from Suzanne Jabour. She's a grief educator working with business leaders and businesses to build grief resilience. Expect to learn about Suzanne's own journey through grief, why it needs to be addressed better in the workplace, and how we can begin to create connection instead of isolation in our own experiences. Thank you for listening. This one was made for your enjoyment. Suzanne, firstly, thank you for coming on today. Can you start by just taking us through your own journey and what brought you into this area working in grief?
Yes. Thank you, first of all, so much for having me. It's so important for us to have these conversations about grief and be modeling for people what a normal conversation about grief can look like. So, my pledge to the audience who made it through the intro is that this is really going to be just a normal conversation where grief is the topic. It will be not heavy. We might even laugh. If we cry, it's okay. But it really is always my intention to just tell my story as a way of sharing what's true and what's real about grief, because so many of us aren't sharing our stories and then we don't know. And to open up conversations for this space where, as you said, we're building connection instead of isolation. Because what happens right now in grief is everyone ends up isolated. And that's part of what, big part of what needs to shift. As is the case with most people in the grief space, I come here out of my own experience. My dad died 25 years ago. Last year was 25 years for my dad and 10 years for my mom. And my son, Ben, was my most recent loss. He died in September of 2020. And there was something about that out of order death, the loss of a child, that really was something I was not prepared for. It was grief at a whole different level. And I really became a student of grief for my own survival because I knew I didn't know enough about it to be able to do it in a way that felt healthy, to be able to do it in a way that felt hopeful, if that makes sense to people, to be able to do it in a way that felt like there was potential for growth. Because I knew almost instantly that the person that I was, I got that dreaded middle of the night phone call from the police. The person I was that went to bed that night no longer existed. And so who was I going to be next really became a lot of what I was curious about. And how was I just going to get through each day when the world no longer made any sense? So it really, my education and my sort of study and now research was based on that need of my own. It was very selfish, and I needed to understand it better. I needed to understand it better to be able to support my daughter, who was 3.5 years older than Ben. So she was 25 when he died. And to just really find a path for us that felt like it wasn't about the story we're told about parents who lose a child, which is generally some version of, they become a husk of their former self and they're never productive again and they kind of curl up in a corner and die, right? And I was 100% sure that was not going to be my story. It's not the story, frankly, of most grieving parents, but it's the story that kind of our collective tells us that, you'll never recover from this. And I thought, well, that's not going to be my story.
Hmm.
What happens when you stand so defiantly against the story you're fed, however, is you have to figure out, if not that, then what? So it really needed to become a lot about curiosity and what was possible. What did survival look like at the beginning? It was really just about survival. How do I
Yeah.
dress myself? How do I feed myself? I remember standing in the shower and thinking, I don't even know how to shower. Like I'm standing in this place where like there's water hitting my head. So I'm in the shower. Okay. And what do I do here? Like, have I washed my hair yet? No, I don't think I did. So if I did, I got to do it again because I don't remember, and really having to talk myself through how to have a shower, which for most of us is something that's so automatic. We don't even think about it. That's why we have great ideas in the shower, because our mind can be creative and expensive because we're just doing automatic stuff. That automaticity was completely gone. So many things like that were happening that I didn't understand and felt really scary. and I think feel really scary for many grievers and for the people around us who are trying to support us who don't know what to say or do. So that really was the beginning of the path that has led me to this place where I look really thoughtfully at the workplace and how we can step up better there. How as supporters of friends or family or someone in our community, we can really step up there. And how as grievers, we can kind of look at the stories we're being fed and look at, the cliches and platitudes that people are saying to us that are mostly harmful. We just need to throw them all away and start over. And how do we as grievers sort of chart our path in this culture that is very grief phobic, very grief illiterate and uninformed and scared? We're so scared that we don't want to do the wrong thing. So we end up doing nothing. And then we're all alone trying
Mm.
to figure this out. So that's kind of how I ended up here, and why I hold such gratitude for hosts like you that open up this space to just have a conversation about it. Because if we could break down that fear and the isolation and the lack of knowledge, we could change everything. So we're going to help start people on that path or help them continue down that path today.
Yeah, that sounds really nice. I think I've spoken to one of my previous guests, and she opened up a lot about a lot of grief she's been through, and it was really eye-opening. I had a lot of sort of response from that as well, and people feeling it with her. But she was very happy to talk about it, and like she said, it keeps their memories alive by talking about it. They want to talk about these people. Um, you spoke there about when that happened, specifically the your son passing. Um, that threw you obviously into a bit of a spiral potentially straight away. But you say that you responded, you didn't want to become someone who would never recover from it. You wanted to be strong and defiant to that. Is that something that's always been in your nature, or was that something that you've sort of evolved over the time?
Well, that's such a good question. And I never had thought about it before, but I quite often am a little bit like, no, that's just dumb. I'm not doing it that way. So I think it was partly an extension of sort of who I am already, and really partly an extension of, all the work that I had done, the self growth development, however you're phrasing that for yourself. I had been really intentionally on a journey of growth for a long, long time. Really,
Mm,
since I'd had my kids, I was like, okay, if I'm going to be the best mom to them that I can be, I have some stuff I need to deal with. And that really was what kind of started me on that path of really being in a growth mindset, for example, and being really curious about things and wanting to figure things out and look at things from a different perspective. So it really was an extension of the path that I was already on. And the path that I was already on had completely blown up.
mm,
So, and I knew that I would need every tool in my toolbox and some that I didn't have yet in order to navigate this path. And, it's so interesting you talking about your previous guest. I'm with her. Like, it absolutely, I was also really sure that me curling up in a ball didn't honor my son. It didn't honor him and the big life that he was living. And I, wish continued to live. It didn't honor me and the life that was still here for me to live. And it didn't model what I wanted for my daughter.
mm,
So they're absolutely, and I don't want to minimize the amount of time we spent curled up in a ball crying in the early days. 100% that's part of the journey. And when you're standing in the shower and you can't remember how to shower and you think your brain has gone off the rails, it's really scary. And that is all normal. But because we don't talk about it, we don't know that. And if so, I talk to people all the time about how when you're pregnant and you've either told people or you start to show, like random strangers will come up to you to tell you they're mostly horrifying birth stories. And as much as when I had my daughter, I didn't understand that. And I thought, why would you come to, like, this is my first, pregnancy that's going to term. Like, I'm going to be in birth. Like, why isn't everyone showering me with their, happy birth stories? But they weren't. It was really interesting that people were sharing their really scary birth stories. And when her birth turned out to be a little bit scary, I was really grateful that I knew I wasn't the only one, right? I knew other people had done it and had successful deliveries, and there was some comfort there. But we don't do that at the other end. So we don't go to someone who's newly grieving and say, oh my gosh, like I had such terrible brain fog and you might have it too. And it was really scary and I didn't know what was wrong with me, but I was really grateful to know that it was normal. And if you ever want to talk about that, I would be happy to share what I experienced and we can compare notes. We don't have those kind of normal conversations about grief. And that's really part of what would shift everything, is if even we were just honest with ourselves about what was happening and thoughtful and contemplative when we have the ability to do so, which in the very earliest survival days, you don't just survive it, just breathe was our mantra. Like we do one hard thing and the rest of the day we just breathe. Well, that's our job.
Mm.
Just breathe and get through the day. And then as that eases a little bit, there's really space. And, what I decided and what I realized was the path for me was to be conscious and curious. So it was conscious about all the emotions. I knew I couldn't stuff any of them. I had to just allow them all. And I had this really funny visual. It's somehow in like a Looney Tunes cartoon version of like the crystal glass that the opera singer is going to sing that note and the glass is going to go psh. I just knew I was that glass, and that glass could not get too full or it would shatter. So it was like allowing all the emotions, even the horrifying ones, the horror, the despair, the despondency, all of it, plus the curiosity and the joy and the gratitude and the like all of it at once in a big tangle. And being curious about like what next? Like how do we get through the day? How do we feed ourselves? How do we
Mm.
go to work? How do we talk to people? How do we try to re-engage in the world on our own timeline, not anybody else's? So much curiosity about how on earth you're supposed to do anything when you've had that kind of catastrophic loss.
And I'm glad you spoke there about accepting those emotions in the early stages, and
Yeah,
that is part of the process, because I think it would be easy for someone to listen to you start talking there about your defiancy in that phase, but that is part of it, and so it's a very natural thing to
absolutely.
absolutely go through all that. You've also mentioned in there, and obviously something that we all will know is grief is something that people do find difficult to talk about. What do you think is the cause of that?
I think it's fear. So I often do a survey or I'll ask people in workshops, when you think back to a time when you didn't show up for someone the way that you wish you had, what held you back? And it's about 98% of the time, people's answer is fear. They're worried that they don't know what to say, they don't know what to do, and they don't want to do any harm. So it's really, a fear from the most loving place, if that makes sense. Like
Mm.
it's because we don't want to hurt the person, we don't want to make it worse. We get all entangled in trying to do it perfectly instead of just making a messy, imperfect effort. And that really holds us back from being able to have those conversations. And I think in a society, where the collective idea is grief should be private, it should be quiet, it should be quick, it should not inconvenience anybody else. It's very hard to then grieve out loud, which is what I decided to do. I was like, you know what? I can't. It is impossible for me to do this quietly, privately, quickly, silently on my own. It's impossible. I won't survive it. I knew that. So then the what if, what if not that, then what became, well, I guess I'm going to grieve out loud. And so I talked about it openly with anybody that would stand still long enough to listen. And, people who said, how are you, actually heard how I was. I'm sure I was just a nightmare. But that's what I had to do to survive. And it really, for me, the facing it, and, what I've learned over the intervening now almost 4 years, is that the facing it is the path. The
Mm.
denial is where we get stuck. Our fear is that if we face all those big emotions, we're going to get stuck in them and we're going to spiral downward.
Mm.
If we can face them and name them and allow them to move, we don't get stuck. Yes, we feel them and they're painful, and that's okay. That's okay. It's a reflection of our love for the person or the situation or the pet or the relationship, whatever it is that we're grieving. Because grief comes in all losses, right? Every change brings loss, every loss brings grief. So we're really grieving all the time.
Yeah.
And there's so much rich conversation we could be having to practice for when those big ones come. And you're facing someone like me who's a grieving mom, grieving out loud. I'm not a good first assignment, right? That's not a place to start practicing new skills because it's terrifying. And I get that. But I had to do that for me. And that was really, that for me was out of character. Like putting myself first and being really clear that if I didn't do that, I wasn't going to make it. That was new for me. And I remember saying to my daughter, you know what? I'm going to take care of myself first. That's my first priority. I will be here 100% for you. And everybody else has to figure it out. I just have no ability to care for everybody else. And everyone else was adults. There was no children that, I wasn't caregiving for anybody or needing to take care of someone who couldn't comprehend what was happening. None of that was part of our picture. That's a whole different layer of complexity. But I was able to be like, you know what? This actually for a while has to be all about me and all about grief.
Yeah.
And how do you live while doing that? Because you have to live while you're grieving, because you're going to grieve for a really long time.
And following on from that then, so establishing that it is something that we do find it hard to talk about, and that being the reason why, what can people do? How can we start to begin to have those conversations with people? Is there any simple tips, any starters that people can do if they're in that situation?
100%. And that's the good news. It's simple, not easy, but it is simple to really shift this around. And one of the places we can do it is to start talking about those griefs that don't feel so big. So if someone, doesn't get a job they applied for example, our go-to is kind of cheerleadery, if that makes sense. So we say
Yeah.
things like, oh, well, there's a better one out there. It wasn't really good for you anyway. It's their loss, right? We say all those kinds of things. What if we shifted that and we started with, wow, like I know you were really excited about that possibility. And I know if you're like me, you had a whole story set up about what that could mean for you going forward. And that's gone. And you must be feeling a whole bunch of big feelings about that. Do you want to share any of them? So we're practicing that conversation in a space that feels lower risk. So that when it is the loss of a loved one or the loss of a relationship or something that feels really big and more scary, we've practiced, right? The other thing to practice is just being in touch with our own emotions. In North America, especially, we're really great from the neck up. We're conditioned and trained and enculturated to be excellent in our head. We're not so good in our body, which is where our emotions are. So if we can start to practice that, right? Practicing, take once a day, thinking, oh, what am I feeling? What's my emotion right now? Oh, maybe I'm happy or I'm excited or I'm sad or I'm despondent or I'm grateful, whatever it is. Grab a feelings wheel off the internet. There's tons of them. Look at all those different words and find your way to the nuances of using those words and really connect it with yourself so that then when you're facing someone who has big emotions, you're used to what that sounds like and how you might label them and how you might talk about them.
Mm.
The other thing to know is if we're specifically supporting someone who's grieving, we've got the system backwards. So we say something really closed, usually one of those old cliches. Oh, they're in a better place. Oh, they would want you to be happy. Oh, they're not suffering any longer. All of those, just write them all down, have a ceremonial burning, rip them up, get rid of them. No more should we say those. And we offer something really open-ended. So we'll offer, oh, we've all heard, anything you need, I'm here for you. Just let me know. Just give me a call. Anything you need, I'll do it. The problem is the closed what we say shuts down the conversation and mostly tells the griever that you're not a safe place for them to be grieving, which for them is all they can do right now. And the open-ended offer, their brain cannot conceptualize what they might need in the future because we can only be in the moment. It's a great, forced presence in the moment.
Mm.
We can't conceptualize what we might need in the future. And when we realize we need something, we can't remember who offered. Right? So both of those things aren't working. That's what's part of what's creating the isolation. When you put that on top of the fear, no wonder we're all isolated, right? If we flip the script and we say something really open from our heart, probably a little bit vulnerable and honest, then we open that space for a conversation, right? We're building connection. We might say something like, when I think of the people I now call my 4 stalwart companions, who were the 4 people that really showed up for me from the very horrifying beginning moments and are still by my side. Almost every single one of them started with something like, I have no idea what to say. This is absolutely devastating. And I'm here with you to help figure it out. And we're just going to do it one day at a time. Do you need to go for a walk or do you need to scream and cry? What could we do right now? Right? What can I do to help you? Is it coffee or tea, right? So the conversation, what we say is really open-hearted. And if you're speaking genuinely from your heart, you can't do harm from that place, right? If we're speaking from our head and we're trying to control what we say and say the exact right thing, we can do harm from there. From our heart, we can't. So we can be less worried about it, even though it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah.
What we offer is the thing that has to be specific, right? I'm going to the grocery store today. Go stand in front of your fridge and tell me what's missing. Do you need milk? Do you need eggs? Do you need peanut butter? Is it bread? Tell me what's missing and I'll bring it this afternoon. Because as a griever, even in those very first days, I could do that. I could go to the fridge and say, oh gosh, okay, the gaps, because usually our fridge is semi-organized. Most of us have a system of sorts. So you can look and go, oh, like there's nothing on the shelf where the milk is supposed to be, or I don't see any bread, or those basic things that will get you through survival, whatever it is that you eat. Open your pantry. Tell me what's missing, right? Do you have 3 recipes that freeze well that you could send me and I'll bring them back to you, ready for you to put in your freezer? Right? Really specific things. And remembering that anything you need, they need too. Right? So maybe if it's a neighbor, someone you don't know that well, you might say, wow, like I know you're grieving, and I miss your whoever, wife, husband, whatever it is, too. And one of the things I know about grief is it's really hard to remember what day it is and to be in touch with time. So on Thursdays when it's garbage day, do you mind if when I take my cans out, could I just sneak into your backyard and get yours too? And then I'll take them back for you at the end of the day? Easy. You're doing it anyways. Takes 2 minutes to do someone else's as well. That's a huge gift to someone who's grieving, who frankly, most of the time doesn't know what day it is.
Yeah, that's really good suggestions. And I like what you spoke about at the start there as well, about starting off by speaking about smaller levels of grief. And I suppose you don't really think of, like you said, a job, not getting a job being grief, but it is. It's the same emotions. It's some yeah. So I really like that sort of start off easy, just work your way into it. And then being vulnerable as well. Again, sort of brings me back to speaking to my previous guest about it. And she said that her partner, her husband, was very supportive, but he'd not been through the same stuff. So he just said, I don't know what you're going through. I can't exactly feel it, but I'm here with you and I'll be with you throughout. And it's just that helps massively. And I think, yeah, I think we always try and say like these cliches that you talk about. And yeah, they're not helpful because they're just hearing them again and again and again.
Yeah, and they're meaningless and they're harmful and the subtext is all bad. And what I think is beautiful about that conversation too is twofold. First of all, it's about that permission, right?
Mm,
So really having the intention that what you say to the person gives them permission to grieve with you, right? Because the one universal about grief is it needs witnessing. So if you can be someone who's prepared to bear witness and just sit with the person while they grieve, that's beautiful. That's so helpful. We need spaces where we can say the person's name. We can talk about what's really happening to us. We can talk about our emotions, how scared we might be, what we're worried about. We need spaces to have those conversations.
mm,
So if you're capable of being that person, that's really beautiful. And that's what that partner did for your guest, right? Was just to say, I don't get what you're going through because I'm experiencing it differently. But like, I'm still here and we're going to figure it out. And whatever you need, like, I'll just walk the path with you and we'll be on parallel paths. They don't have to be the same. And that's the other critical thing, is to remember that every person grieves differently. And every person, even if you're grieving the same person. So I knew that my grief for my son was very different than my daughter's grief for her brother.
mm,
And in a way, we weren't even really grieving the same person, right? Even though it's the same body, the same person in our family, right? Our relationships with them were different. Like a mother's relationship to a son is very different than a sibling relationship. And my kids were really close. They traveled together. They did all kinds of things together. So she was really losing a very important person in her life. And I was too. And we didn't do it the same way.
mm,
And that was okay. And I remember saying to her, I'm choosing to grieve out loud. That's what's I'm just sensing is how I'm going to survive this. And that's not what you're choosing. And that's okay. You get to do it your way. And we need to be aware that, if we're not doing it out loud and really open about it, sometimes we end up compartmentalizing, and we have to be aware of that. And just, that's not a good long-term strategy. Short-term can be very useful, right? When there's just stuff we have to get done, you have to sometimes put it in a box, but then you can't abandon that box, right? So you're always checking. What's in the box? Oh, it's still there. Is it bigger and scarier? Is it not as scary, right? We're aware of the box. We're opening the box. But it was really important for me to give her permission to do it her way, and vice versa. For her to be like, yeah, okay, and I see how you're doing it, and that's not what I want, but it's okay for you to do it that way too. And that's how, even among families, right? Even in spouses, especially with the death of a child, the divorce rate is really, really high. And the theorizing is that it's because we're so it's so difficult for us to allow each other to grieve differently and to not be in judgment of how we're doing it. Right? Because if I'm grieving out loud, so I appear to be grieving all the time, and you're grieving quietly, so it looks from the outside like you're not grieving at all, it's very easy for us to be judgmental about each other.
Yeah, of
And
course. Yeah.
that's where we get into trouble. So it's about that permission piece. The more we can give permission to grievers to be doing what they need to do and not trying to tell them what they should be doing or fix them because they're not broken in a way that we can fix, and to just give that permission, be a safe space, that's what's really going to help.
Yeah. No, I really like those points. And we've spoken there about what we can do for other people.
Mhm.
Is there anything we can do for ourselves? Obviously, we never know when we are going to grieve.
Yeah.
But is there anything we can do to help us ahead of time when we get to that point? We are a bit more prepared for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. You can't. People ask me this on occasion, and it's so. I'm really in curiosity about it because it's a relatively new question, and I don't know that you can prepare, but you can build some skills in your toolbox that will be helpful,
Mm.
right? So similarly to how could you help someone else, we're going to help ourselves the same way. The more we're able to name our emotions and be in touch with them, means that when those big ones come, they're not as scary, right? We're not as confused. And if we can hold curiosity about what's possible as a way of going through the world, then when ruptures happen, little ones too, we're looking at it from a place of curiosity and not a place of victimhood. Because when we fall into that victim space, it's really easy to get stuck, right? It's
Mm.
really easy to just spiral in the anger, in the frustration, in the, all of those emotions that are around why, how dare this thing have happened to me, right?
Yeah.
And it's very hard to move from that place. So if we can be in touch with our emotions, and again, it's a space where we can practice just within ourselves, how am I feeling today? What do I need? And really being as in touch with ourselves as we can be in a world that's not encouraging us to do that, right? So you do have to be a little bit that defiant one, because the world's not really giving us permission for that. Not in my culture anyway.
Yeah.
It wants me to do. There's not a lot of being, and we need to do more being. And that really helps us, if we can acknowledge and practice just with ourselves on those smaller griefs, taking the time to face them, to acknowledge them, to allow the emotions to go through. I was on a grief cafe last night with some grievers, and I was talking to them about a smash room. It was clear that a number of them really would benefit from a smash room. And they'd never heard of such a thing. I was like, oh my gosh, okay, you're all going to get, like, at the end of this call, you're all going to get off and you're going to Google, like, where is my local smash room? So if you know the ways that work for you to move those emotions, because they're energy in motion, we have to move them. And
Yeah.
sometimes, most of the time, that has something to do with how we move our body and ways we move our body to keep them flowing, especially when they feel big and scary. Those are ways that we really can be more prepared because we know the big griefs are coming. It's the only guarantee, right? Death and taxes.
Yeah.
It's 100% guaranteed that you will grieve the death of a loved one in this lifetime. It's 100% guaranteed. So let's have conversations about that.
Yeah.
If someone's grieving, let's be a space for them so we can learn from their experience. So when it happens to us, we're not so scared and we're not so worried. I really, when the brain fog was so intense for me and I had no idea that's what was happening and that it was really a thing that's called grief brain and lasts for about 5 years. I know that now. I feel much more confident and comfortable with the fact that my brain doesn't really work correctly yet. But at the beginning, that was terrifying because I didn't know that that was a very normal symptom that happens to almost everybody. So when it happens to you, you think there's something wrong with you. And then people already think there's something wrong with you because grief is wrong in our culture. So I wasn't also going to admit to the fact that my brain didn't work anymore, right?
Mm.
That how am I going to tell my boss that my brain also doesn't work? That's not a good, situation to feel like you're in. But if I had known, because people had told me their stories, that was possible, first of all, I would have had someone I could phone back and say, okay, this brain thing, like, tell me more about that because I'm really in the swill of it. And I would have known that it was normal. But we don't understand that part of grief is the brain fog, the physical symptoms, the pain, the muscular weakness, the digestive issues, the sleep problems, the lack of connection with time, inability to concentrate and comprehend reading. Like, there's so many things that are so normal, but because we don't talk about them, everyone that happens makes us more scared. And everyone that happens, we just have to go, yeah, that's normal. I don't have to like it. but it can be normal.
Hmm. And what are some of those symptoms then? You listed off a few there, and you spoke about grief brain as well. I've never heard of that personally. Are you able to just explain that a bit more and what some of the symptoms that we may experience and, like you say, be scared of? But it might be good for people just to be aware of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it helps us as supporters too to understand that what's happening is real. And so the person we're supporting isn't, we tend to kind of think people are making it up or they're making it worse than it really is. They're really not. If they're telling you what's happening for them, it's really what's happening for them. So brain fog, grief brain is probably the one that's the most scary and the least talked about and the most impactful. So it's kind of a bad trifecta of things.
Yeah.
And it's really happening on a physical level, like neurologically, your brain is actually changing. And there's some amazing research being done. One of my favorite books about grief, if you're at the stage where you can read a book, is called The Grieving Brain. And it's Mary Frances O'Connor, who's a brilliant doctor, researcher in the US. And she's doing functional MRIs on people who are grieving. So actually watching what's happening in the brain, which isn't science cool, like so cool. So I could nerd out about that for hours. But what people really need to know is that the confusion is real. The feeling like you don't remember how to do anything that the day before you knew how to do without even thinking is real. Your brain is reprogramming itself, and it's also protecting you a little bit from the horror of what's happened because sometimes it's too much for us to face all at once. So the pathways in your brain are being reprogrammed so that your brain knows that your loved one is no longer here. So those moments that you think, oh yeah, when I get home, like I would think all the time, oh, when I get home, I'm going to tell Ben that funny thing that I saw. Or I'm going to, oh, I heard about this show that I know he would like. I'm going to tell him when I get home. Or I'm going to tell him when he gets home, right? It's really common. We think that our loved one is going to walk through the door, even though we intellectually know that they're dead. Our heart really wants them
Hmm.
to come back through the door. And our brain is still reprogramming that path that expects them to come through the door. So it feels a lot like confusion. It feels a lot like your brain just doesn't work anymore. Reading becomes really hard for a lot of people. That's really normal. I'm a voracious reader. I have been since I was a little kid. And I couldn't read a, a nonfiction book. I'm just now. So Ben died September 2020. I'm coming up on 4 years. About the last 6 months, I've started to be able to read nonfiction books. And I read a lot of very fluffy fiction because even something with like complex compound sentences in it, my brain would just go, yeah, I can't. Like I can't follow the thread of a sentence I couldn't follow.
Okay.
So it really is that foggy and that much like, what on earth do I do? Who am I and what am I doing here? And how, and it's cognitive dissonance too, right? It's that sense that it looks like the rest of the world is moving on without you, like nothing happened. And my reality is a post apocalyptic nightmare. And how do those two things exist at the same time? And how do I from here connect it all with there? Because
Hmm.
they feel so separate and so incomprehensible almost. Like what I'm experiencing is incomprehensible, and the fact that you're not experiencing it is incomprehensible, and that the world is still turning like nothing happened, I can't even fathom. Right.
Hmm.
So that's the brain fog piece. It just feels a lot like confusion. And like what you used to be able to do, you can't do anymore. So imagine that person in your workplace, right? They're going to need some scaffolding. And there's some really simple things we can do to support them and help them. So the brain fog is a big one. Muscular skeletal issues are really common. So a lot of people have muscle pain. I had really severe muscle weakness. And actually, I was talking with my physiotherapist the other day and saying, okay, I think we're at the point where we need to remind these muscles how to fire. Like my core muscles completely gave up the ghost. I could stand, but if I was sitting, I had to be leaning against the back of the chair. I couldn't hold my body up while sitting. It was that level of like these muscles just don't work. So that's very normal. Being clumsy, very normal. Digestive issues, eating too much or too little, not feeling nauseous all the time, all of the various, you know, digestion just being upset, right? We don't have to get into the nitty gritty of it, but just think of all your digestive issues. All of those, every end of the spectrum, very normal. Sleep issues are super normal, sleeping too much, sleeping not enough, and none of it feeling restful,
Hmm.
right? I didn't dream for that I remembered for maybe 3 years. It was a long time till I was like, oh, I just remembered a dream. And I hadn't done that for a very long time. So all of those kinds of things. It's happening to your whole body. It's a whole body experience.
Hmm. It's good. Yeah, it's good to sort of share some of those, and so people can be aware. If there's someone who's grieving, who you know, if it's a colleague, a friend, and they've said they're okay, they said they're doing okay, but maybe they're not. Are there any sort of indicators that we might be able to look out for that people aren't doing as well as they're letting on?
Yeah, you can really watch for them just really not being themselves,
Hmm.
right? While knowing that who they are is going to change, right? And there should be aspects of the person that you know. So if you're really not seeing those aspects, the first survival phase, we're making no judgments at all, right? We're just offering help repeatedly. Even if they keep saying they're okay, keep offering help. Keep offering to come and go for a walk, or just sit and listen, or sit in silence, or just keep offering. Because we also have this collective fear of being a burden, especially for women, right? We don't want to be a burden. I don't want to burden anybody. So we don't often want to take people up on their offers. So specific offers repeatedly for years is great because people can use the support. And even if they feel like they should be able to do it themselves, there will be days where they just can't. And if you happen to luck into one of those days, they might say yes. And if they say no, and if they say they're doing okay, then it's okay to acknowledge that and say, wow, I'm so happy that you're feeling okay in this moment. And if in the next moment you're not, that's okay with me too. Right? Just creating that space where being not okay is all right. Because people say all the time, oh, how are you doing? And what we expect to hear back is fine. Okay. We don't even stop walking half the time when we say it anymore. So stopping to say, oh, I'm so glad you're having a good moment. And if the next moment isn't, I'm here for that too. That's okay with me too. Both are fine.
Yeah. And going along the line, so obviously it's a very long process and it can be different for everyone. It looks different for
Yeah.
everyone. It's a different length of time potentially as well. Down the line, obviously there's life events. So what would have been their birthday or what might have been
Mm-hmm.
an anniversary can bring up these memories again. Is there something that people can do? Should they be trying to minimize that, or is that a welcome part of the journey? Will that go on forever? How does that work?
Yes, and yes, and yes. So for some people, it really works to ignore the day. That's not what works for me. For me, we have rituals and we make plans for both Ben's birthday and his anniversary. And certainly our birthdays remain quite difficult. Everybody's birthday was really impossible for me to fathom that people continued to have birthdays when Ben wasn't going to have any more. I was so angry that people still had birthdays, right, for a long time. For me, it's really about integration, right? The goal is integration of the grief and figuring out how we bring our person with us as we move forward. So for me, that looks a lot like we're going out to celebrate, or we're doing something that acknowledges them on that day, even if what we're doing is ignoring the rest of the world and just having that day be about our grief.
Mm.
That's okay. Or it's about, the person we're missing was really celebratory and loved this particular restaurant, or loved this particular kind of music, or loved this particular whatever. Doing something that really connects you to them is super powerful. And I think a lot of that goes on forever. When my dad died, Ben was a baby. He was 4 months old, and Kathleen turned 4 the next day. So she was very young as well. And one of the things we did with him is we had candles. We went to a candle lighting ceremony every Christmas, and they gave you those little like church choir candles, the little tapers that they have in church. So my dad died 25 years ago. And for years and years after that, any family dinner, like Thanksgiving, whatever, we would light the grandpa candle. And my daughter did it for years until she taught my son how to do it as he got old enough. And then the two of them would light it together. And over time, my mom just kept buying like those little thin candles, and she bought little holders for them. And it was a whole ritual that we had for my dad. And we were cleaning out my hutch the other day and getting rid of some things that no longer served us. And we came across one of the original candles. So we had kept one of the tapers from those original services. And we had still some of the little candles that my mom had and some of her little candle holders. And 25 years later, and my daughter said, oh my gosh, we still have grandpa candles. Oh, it's going to make me well up just thinking about it. And it was so beautiful that we had found a ritual that was really meaningful to her at 4, that she still remembered she'll be 30 this September.
Yeah.
So 26 years later, she still was like, well, we can't get rid of those. Like, we got rid of tons of candles. the grandpa candles all went lovingly back in. And I said to her, you know what? Like, maybe we need to start lighting those again. Like, we need to have some grandpa candle moments where we're like, oh, this is a day where we want grandpa to be here. And of course, that brings in my mom. It will bring in Ben. It will bring in, my grandparents and, all the aunts and uncles, right, that are
Mm.
associated with my dad. And it just was so beautiful to think that we had created that ritual really out of just wanting some kind of touchstone with him. Because, of course, at family events, he was such a pivotal center of it all. Like, he carved the turkey, right? Like, you've lost the person who carves the turkey. He needs to be at the table somehow. So finding those rituals that are meaningful for you and for the other people that are grieving with you, I think is really powerful and helpful, much more than pretending it's not a big day. And sometimes, for me, I still really struggle in April. April is Ben's birthday. The end of September is his anniversary. Both of those months, I can feel it coming. Like, you can feel the emotions getting more raw. You can feel the grief getting closer. And I just ride that wave because I know for me, that's the way. Finding your way is how you need to do it.
Yeah. And I think, again, you're just highlighting that really nice thing that everyone is different and it looks
Yeah.
different for everyone. And I think that's sort of the resonating theme as we go through this. And
Yeah.
that some people may want to shut off on that day and some people may want to do a ritual, like you said, and that sounds really nice. So, um,
Yeah.
as you've gone through your journey, as you've learned more and more and you've studied more and more, you noticed a bit of a problem within working environments. Can you tell us a bit more about why you took that path and went into sort of educating workplaces?
I really did. And what was so interesting, because I went back to work 2 weeks after Ben died, and my immediate supervisor was amazing. And we had become friends. We'd worked together for years. He knew Ben. He was also grieving Ben. He was very understanding. And my team was great in that they just pulled a whole bunch of duties off my plate because they knew that it was impossible for me to do all the things I normally did. So I kept very limited duties, and they all stepped in to take them on. Besides that, the organization that I worked for was completely useless and in some ways actively harmful.
Right. Okay.
And I got really curious because when I was on griever forums or places where people are talking about their grief, so many people had left their jobs. And I couldn't figure out why. So this is me, right? Conscious and curious. I'm like, oh, here's something to be curious about. What is happening? Why is this happening? And part of it is because our bereavement leave is way not enough. So in North America, the average is 3 to 5 days. For many of us, we haven't even gotten to the celebration of life or the funeral in that point. So sometimes you're having to advocate for yourself to get an additional day off to go do that. 3 to 5 days, we barely know which way is up. In fact, we don't know which way is up.
Mm.
And because of our grief phobic, grief unknowledgeable culture, the expectation is that we're going to come back to work like nothing happened. Right. And remember, I'm in a post apocalyptic nightmare that the rest of the world seems to not remember happened. So there's already a big disconnect in our realities. And we're supposed to come back to work and not bother anybody and not say anything and just pretend there's nothing wrong. It's actually an inhuman ask to ask people to do that. And that's part of why people end up leaving. And the cost is in the US, the latest study, which was 2020, they did the study in 22, released it in 23, so very recent data. They calculated the cost of grief in the workplace at $100 billion annually.
Wow.
So this is a big ticket loss that we're too scared to talk about. Anything else that was costing businesses $100 billion, they'd be doing something about, right? I can't even really conceptualize $100 billion. It's massive what we're losing. And we're losing it in drops in productivity, right? We're losing it in presenteeism and absenteeism, in people being on extended leaves, and in turnover. And we can fix all of that with some skills and some education and a policy, ideally,
Yeah.
that really levels the playing field around what's available and makes it so that it's equitable, right? Everybody gets access to the same types of things that are appropriate for their role. Because the person who's the executive assistant to the CEO is not going to get, be able to access the same things as the frontline worker who's a cashier, right? For example, so different roles are going to have different ability to access support. But there's some really simple things that we can do that are either cost neutral or very low cost that give people a lot of permission to be their whole grieving selves at work. And that's really the paradigm shift that we need, because expecting someone to come to work like nothing happened is impossible. And in fact, it sets up exactly what employers don't want. When I'm talking to employers and, bosses, company owners, HR professionals, they don't want drama. They want as little drama as possible, right? If you're setting the situation up so someone who's in deep grief, early acute grief, is supposed to come to work like nothing happened, there is going to be drama, because that person is going to struggle to self regulate. They're going to struggle to not cry at their desk. They're going to be crying in the bathroom. Please let us stop living in a world where we're crying in the bathroom. That's not okay, right? But that's what's happening. And that creates drama, because if I'm crying at my desk, my thoughtful coworkers are now all standing around my desk trying to help me. Now I'm overwhelmed. They're not productive. The work has ground to a halt, and there's a whole bunch of drama.
Mm.
If that person knows that the policy allows that when they feel overwhelmed, they get to get up from their desk and go for a walk for 5, 10, however many minutes. They have their cell phone with them if there's an emergency, and they come back when they're able to cope. That shifts, the drama's gone. They get up, they poke their head into their supervisor and say, I used to teach elementary school. The kids would put up their W because they needed to go to the washroom, and you would say, yep, off you go,
Yeah.
right? At a certain age, not the kinders, but the grade 3s. Right? So what if we said, we're all adults who need to be treated like adults, and most of us want to be at work. Most of us financially have to be at work. And we want to be there because it's a place where we get a bit of a respite from our grief, and we touch that normal world that's moving on without us, right? We get to play with what that might be like. How do we re-engage with that? It's really valuable for us to be at work. And the way that it's set up right now is unintentionally harmful.
Mm.
So if we have a menu in our policy that says, okay, well, what of these and then you're giving your supervisor skills, a place to start the awkward conversation, right? Because when we survey managers, the research shows that it's 30% of them admitted, right? And I think the number is probably way higher, but they don't want to admit it. 30% acknowledge that they want more training around how to support someone who's grieving.
Right.
Because they know it's going to happen, and they know when the person shows up and says something, they don't know what to do or say. And they're bumbling about and they're making something up on the fly, which is never good. And that's not healthy for your organization. So what if the policy said, then we hold it up and we say, great, here's the policy. What would help you this week? And then let's touch base at the end of next week. Let's make a plan for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll touch base again and we'll revise the plan. Because what seems to happen now is one of two extremes. Either there's no acknowledgement at all. Literally, I've had grievers tell me they went back to work and nobody said a word. Nobody even acknowledged it. So imagine how hurtful that is, and how isolated you would feel, and how much you feel like, what am I even doing here? Right?
Yeah.
Literally bonkers. Or they acknowledge it all at once, and then you're overwhelmed, and then nobody says anything after that, right? So both of those are problematic. Or they do like my work did and pull a bunch of things off your plate temporarily, which is brilliant, but they never give them back. So we end up with those two different ends of the spectrum, right? And one woman I was working with was saying that what happened to her is her office was brilliant at the beginning. They pulled a bunch of tasks off her plate, which was amazing because she couldn't do them all. Her team stepped up. It was wonderful. But they did it without consulting her and without having a plan for how to give her those tasks back. So what ended up happening over time is, as her capacities regrew and she was able to take on more and more things, they weren't offered back to her. They kind of became those other people's tasks. And what she was left with was the stuff that she didn't really like doing. So she ended up leaving that company, even though they had started off so brilliantly, because she couldn't figure out what the path was back to having her full job that she really loved, and to not being, her identity in the workplace had changed to that woman whose son died, who needed all of our help. And so there was no path to really being fully reintegrated, which is ultimately what we want for our team members, right? Is that at the beginning, they need a lot of support. They need less support over time. They take all their tasks back. The tasks get adjusted. However, most workplaces are pretty flexible and tasks move around over time, but you need a path. So that's where that policy can be really helpful, right? What of these offerings would be helpful for you for the next couple of weeks? Do we want to try? For sure, people need permission to get up and go for a walk when they need to self-regulate, right? We do that in kindergartens and preschools, right? We have the quiet corner. I want every office to have a quiet corner, right? No more crying in the bathroom. I'm just going to go to the quiet corner and I'm just going to breathe and I'm going to think my thoughts and I'm going to feel my feelings and then I can come back and be productive. Because most of us really want to be engaged in the workplace. We really want to be there. So much of our identity and our social circle and our routines are tied to our work that when that all disappears too, on top of a catastrophic loss, it's just much, much more complicated. So workplaces really can step up and be incredibly helpful in that process happening. So you're taking exceptional care of your people. And, for us as a collective in the US, there's $100 billion at stake every year. We need to fix that.
And following on from that, then, what is something or some things that managers, people who work in that managerial role, or even workplaces as a whole, if people are owning companies, what can they implement to really support the people under them?
There's a whole bunch of things, and it really, like our conversation about supporting people in our personal life, goes back partly to the emotional intelligence of the leadership, the amount of honesty that they're sharing, because we really can't ask our team members to be more open and vulnerable and honest than the leadership is prepared to be. It's not safe to do that. So that's a place to start on the sort of emotional side. And we're not going to do therapy at the boardroom table, but we can name emotions when they happen, right? Every organization has grief embedded in it. And when those losses happen, your product launch doesn't go the way that you want. You have to restructure. Your quarterly earnings aren't where you want them to be. Everybody has a bunch of emotions about that. And if we can start to name those to shift those conversations. So before the debrief and pivot, we have 2 minutes, right? Where someone said, where the leader says, wow, I'm feeling a whole bunch of feelings about this. Maybe you are too. I'm feeling really frustrated and I'm super excited about what's coming next. But that frustration is there too. And it's okay for us to have big emotions about this. That's a really powerful place to start if you're looking at your workplace culturally. Once the workplace culture is where you want it to be, and even as you're in that, on that ongoing journey, you really can be looking at the practical, specific supports you can offer people, right? So permission to leave their desks as they need to go for a break, permission to get help when they need it, to reach out and say, wow, I'm really struggling today. I'm going to need some extra support, right? Setting up systems, right? So many organizations have shared calendars, shared documents, all of those things that technologically we're able to do so easily. What if, understanding that in brain fog, especially in the early days, grievers struggle with their relationship with time. What if on the shared calendar, you had alerts for every meeting? So 10 minutes before the meeting, everybody's computer was going to give them an alert. Then the griever doesn't have to be worried all day that they're going to miss the meeting. So that's off their plate. They can actually get some work done. And for the rest of the team, it's freed that little space of their brain too, right? Everybody knows, oh, we're going to get an alert. So we can be in the middle of something and we get 10 minutes notice that we need to wrap up what we're doing and pivot to the meeting, right? It's really powerful for everyone. Everything you're going to do for the griever helps everybody on the team, which is part of the magical ripple of really stepping up in this area. It makes such a difference for everyone. We can document deliverables, for example. So in brain fog, one of the things that happens is sequential tasks become really difficult. So you have to do A to get to B, to get to C, to get to D. I would end up at B standing around going, oh, shoot, like I know there's something I'm supposed to be doing here, but I have no idea what it is. If you can document some of those things so that the griever knows, they can just go in and be like, okay, what do I do next? Even if it feels so simplistic and kind of silly, it takes that pressure of remembering off when our brain is busy doing a bunch of other things. Even if I never need to look at that document, I know it's there. And that gives a level of comfort, right? When the deliverables are, break down small tasks, right? All of the things we know how to do to be really effective, we can document, we can calendar, we can put alerts. I've never been more reliable on the computer in my pocket that we call a cell phone than since Ben died, right? I use the alarms on that every single day. The last thing I do before bed is I look at my schedule for the next day and I set those 10-minute alarm alerts. So 10 minutes before I'm supposed to do something, the labeled alarm that literally said podcast rings for me. So I go, oh, I have 10 minutes. That's what I'm doing next. I can pivot, get myself in the space for the task, right? We can set those up for the grievers because in the early days, it's really hard to do that for yourself. And if someone's doing it with you and for the whole team, you can see how that isolation is breaking down too, right? It's not just about me. It's about how do we keep our team functioning when one person needs extra support? Well, we give them the support that we need, and that helps everyone. And we can do that for all kinds of things. My specialty is helping you do that for grievers.
Awesome. I think that's a really nice place to end it for today. So I just want to thank you from me for coming on and sharing your expertise and your own experiences as well. It's been really beneficial for me to learn a lot more, and hopefully for the people listening to really take some stuff away. If people want to find you online and follow and keep up to date with what you're doing, is there a place they can find that?
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is suzannejabour.com. So first name, last name.com. Everything you need is there. And if you go to suzannejabour.com/podcasts, because if you're someone who loves podcasts, this is a great resource. You'll get an email from me with about 10 or 15, the list changes all the time, of my favorite recent appearances. So if you loved this conversation and you want to know more, every conversation is different and you hear something different each time. So you can get that as a free thing. And then you can link from there to all the socials. I'm on all of them. I really need to embrace TikTok, but I have TikTok phobia. But I keep hearing the message that I'm supposed to be there. So soon on TikTok, but for now, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, I'm on all the places, and I'd be happy to hear from you and hear what you need, so that I can make sure what I'm talking about is really helpful for people. And I appreciate you so much, Sam. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Yeah, my pleasure. And yeah, hopefully people will learn a lot and use a lot of the information they've heard today. From my side, if people have enjoyed the episode, if you can share it with someone, share it with someone you think might find use from it or enjoy it. If you can rate the show, that really helps as well. And also you can follow us on Instagram at Lonely Chapter Podcast. And lastly from me, thank you for listening.